If you were an American tanker in 1945, there was one thing you feared more than enemy tanks or artillery. It was a single soldier with a cheap metal tube. One shot, and your tank with your crew could be gone. By the end of the war, these disposable weapons knocked out more Allied armor than Tigers and Panthers combined. So how did the Germans create something so simple and so deadly? And then, why were some of the early attempts so bizarre? When the Second World War broke out in 1939, tanks had just enough armor to stop machine gun fire, sometimes not even that. The weapons designed to kill them were still the same ones that worked in the First World War. Anti-tank rifles and small-caliber towed guns did the job, and nobody was rushing to replace them. The Germans relied heavily on the 37mm towed anti-tank gun. It was light, mobile, and effective against the tanks of the late 1930s. But when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, everything changed. The Soviets threw T-34s and KV-1s into the fight, tanks that were far better armed and armored than anything the Germans had faced before. Suddenly, that 37mm gun couldn't penetrate anything meaningful. German soldiers started calling it the door knocker because hitting a T-34 just made noise without doing any real damage. Now, the Germans knew this was coming. Even before the war began, they understood that armor technology was advancing fast and bigger guns would be needed. They were already working on 50mm and 75mm anti-tank guns, but getting them produced and deployed in time was the problem. Meanwhile, their infantry was stuck facing tanks they couldn't kill. Anti-tank rifles had the same issue. These were oversized infantry rifles firing special armor-piercing rounds, fine against light tanks early in the war. Soviet anti-tank rifles, with their 14.5mm rounds, could still be dangerous to later German tanks if they hit a weak spot at close range. They were dangerous enough that the Germans started mounting improvised side skirts on their panzers, even on newer tanks like the Panther, to tumble incoming rounds and prevent penetration. But as tank armor kept getting thicker, rifles simply couldn't keep up. There were also magnetic charges and anti-tank mines, but using those meant physically climbing onto an enemy tank and sticking them there. You can imagine how that worked out in combat. These were last-ditch options, not something you'd want to depend on. So what every army needed was something new. A weapon portable enough for infantry to carry, cheap enough to mass produce, simple enough that anyone could use it with minimal training, and powerful enough to kill a modern tank at some reasonable distance. Not point blank, but not a kilometer away either, something in between. Now, the shaped charge was the concept everyone was excited about. Unlike a regular explosive that blasts in all directions, a shaped charge focuses its energy into a concentrated jet of superheated metal. When it hits armor, that jet cuts through and sprays molten fragments into the crew compartment. It doesn't need to punch through with kinetic force the way a solid shell does. It essentially melts its way through. And here's the thing, building the warhead wasn't actually the hard part. Many countries figured that out. The real challenge was delivering that warhead accurately onto an enemy tank from a safe enough distance, using something a regular infantryman could carry and fire. This is where things got creative, sometimes a little too creative. Before anyone figured out the right answer, there were plenty of wrong ones. Some were so strange you'd think they were jokes, but they weren't. These were real weapons, issued to real soldiers, and they showed just how difficult this problem was to solve. Let's start with the Germans, because when it came to engineering creativity, they were always willing to try something unconventional. They created the Panzerwurfmine, which translates to anti-tank mine. But it wasn't a mine in the way you'd think. This was a hand-thrown shaped charge, basically an anti-tank football. You might assume this was some desperate early war improvisation, something cobbled together before better options existed. But no, the Panzerwurfmine was designed and issued at the time when the Panzerfaust already existed. And the Panzerfaust was actually quite effective. So why bother with a thrown charge? The answer is that they wanted something even simpler and cheaper. And technically, the Panzerwurfmine worked. A soldier would throw it like a football at an enemy tank, and if it landed at a 90-degree angle, the shaped charge would detonate and punch through. But here's the problem. The thing weighed about 3 pounds. How far can an average person throw 3 pounds with any accuracy? Well, not very far. And the lethal radius of the explosion was actually greater than the throwing range for most soldiers. So you'd throw it, then immediately dive into a foxhole and hope for the best. Of course, if an enemy tank was close enough for you to throw something at it, you probably had bigger problems anyway. Then, someone thought, what if we don't throw it by hand? What if we launch it somehow? The Germans came up with the Panzerwurfkorper 42, which was an anti-tank grenade mounted on top of a flare gun. You'd load a blank cartridge and the flare gun would launch the grenade. Sounds clever, except the recoil was severe. So bad that they had to add a stock to the flare pistol just to make it usable. Even then, range and accuracy were terrible, but the shaped charge itself worked, which kept people interested in the concept. The next logical step was rifle grenades. Instead of a flare gun, you'd mount the shaped charge on the muzzle of a standard infantry rifle. Load a blank cartridge, fire, and the grenade flies toward the target. The British, Americans, and Germans all developed their own versions. Range was better, maybe up to 100 meters, but the recoil was punishing. And trying to hit a moving tank at that distance while it's shooting at you is not the easiest thing to do. The Germans even tried mounting large-shaped charge grenades on their obsolete 37mm anti-tank guns, the same door knocker that couldn't penetrate modern armor anymore. This was the Stielgranate 41, and you might have seen it in Band of Brothers. The idea was to give the old gun a second life by putting a big grenade on the muzzle that would be propelled by a blank cartridge. The penetration was decent, enough to threaten any tank if it hit at a good angle. But you were still hauling around a 37mm cannon, which defeated the purpose of a portable anti-tank weapon. Eventually, it was abandoned. Now, the British took a completely different approach. Their weapon was called the PIAT, short for Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. Very plain name compared to the German style, but the weapon itself was unique. The PIAT wasn't rocket-propelled at all. It used a spigot, basically a heavy steel rod powered by a strong spring inside the launcher. On top sat a grenade with a hollow tube containing a small propellant charge. When you pulled the trigger, the rod shot forward, struck the grenade, and launched it, while the propellant charge gave it an extra push. This gave it one major advantage: no backblast. When you fire a Panzerfaust or a bazooka, there's a massive blast of flame and smoke shooting out the back, which reveals your position instantly and makes it impossible to fire from enclosed spaces without getting burned. The PIAT didn't have that problem. You could fire it from inside a building, from a trench, from anywhere, and nobody would see the signature flash. But the PIAT had its own issues. It weighed 32 pounds, which is a lot to carry around. The recoil from that spring slamming back hit the shooter's shoulder hard. And here's the annoying part. In theory, when the grenade launched, the recoil was supposed to recock the spring automatically, so you could just load another grenade and fire again. In practice, this didn't always happen. When it failed, the soldier had to stand up, plant the PIAT vertically on the ground, and physically pull the spring back with both arms while stepping on the shoulder pad. That's not something you want to do while someone is shooting at you. On top of that, about a quarter of the grenades were duds. Imagine lining up a perfect shot on a tank, pulling the trigger, and hearing nothing but a dull thud as the grenade bounces off. British troops had a love-hate relationship with the PIAT, and it's easy to understand why. The Americans took a different route entirely. Their M1 bazooka was the first practical mass-issued rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon, entering combat in late 1942 in North Africa. For the first time, a two-man team could carry something light and effective enough to actually threaten enemy armor. The bazooka fired a 60mm rocket with a shaped charge warhead. One soldier aimed and fired, while the other carried extra rockets and loaded them from behind. Effective range was up to 150 meters, far better than anything hand-thrown or spring-powered. Penetration was around 75 to 100 millimeters, enough to kill most tanks of the early war from the side. But it had problems too. Early models used a battery to send an electrical current to the rocket's igniter, and batteries don't work well in cold weather. In the freezing conditions of a European winter, the bazooka sometimes just wouldn't fire when you needed it most. Later versions switched to a magneto trigger to fix this, but the reputation for unreliability stuck around. The Soviets, interestingly, never developed their own equivalent during the war. They kept using anti-tank rifles longer than anyone else and supplemented them with effective but dangerous methods like Molotov cocktails and satchel charges thrown onto tanks at close range. When they captured German Panzerfausts, they used them eagerly. They experimented with something called the RPG-1, but it came too late to see real action. So by 1943, everyone was struggling with the same problem. The shaped charge worked, the warhead technology was there, but delivering it accurately, safely, and cheaply remained unsolved. And then the Germans figured it out. The Panzerfaust wasn't complicated, and that was the whole point. It was a single-shot, disposable launcher with a preloaded warhead, and almost anyone could use it with minimal instruction. The tube was factory-packed with black powder propellant, On top sat the warhead, a shaped charge designed to punch through armor. When a soldier wanted to fire, he'd rest the tube on his shoulder or tuck it under his arm, flip up the simple leaf sight, and squeeze the trigger bar. This ignited a small primer, which set off the main propellant charge, which launched the warhead forward. At the same time, the blast shot out the back of the tube, cancelling the recoil. The result was a weapon with almost no kick at all, but that backblast was dangerous. Anyone standing within about 10 meters, directly behind the tube when it fired, could be burned or killed. The Germans painted red warning labels on it that translated to "Danger, Intense Fire Blast." Firing from a small room meant getting burned and concussed even if the shot hit its target, so you only did that when you had no other choice. The warhead itself could penetrate anywhere from 140 to 200 millimeters of armor, depending on the model. For 1943, this was enormous. It could defeat any Allied tank from the side or rear, and most from the front as well. The shape charge focused all that explosive energy into a superheated jet that went through steel like it wasn't there. The catch was range. The first model was called the Panzerfaust 30, and that number referred to its effective range in meters. 30 meters is almost point blank. The sights had notches for 30, 60, and 80 meters. But realistically, if you wanted to hit something, you needed to be dangerously close. And the warhead flew in a high arc because of its low velocity, which made aiming at a moving tank even harder. Still, the weapon weighed only 5 to 7 kilograms. A single soldier could carry 1 or 2 without much trouble. He didn't need a loader, didn't need special training, didn't need batteries or complicated firing mechanisms, just aim and squeeze. If enemy armor got close enough, he had a real chance of killing it. Now, the Panzerfaust wasn't the only solution the Germans came up with. They also developed the Panzerschreck, which took a different approach. The name translates to tank terror, keeping with their dramatic naming style. This one came about after the Germans captured American bazookas and decided to make their own version. And being Germans, they made it bigger. The bazooka fired a 60mm rocket, while the Panzerschreck fired an 88mm rocket with a larger warhead, giving it penetration of up to 200mm. That was enough to kill any Allied tank from any angle. Unlike the Panzerfaust, the Panzerschreck was reusable, with much better range and accuracy. It even had a small shield attached to protect the operator's face from the backblast. German troops nicknamed it the Ofenrohr, meaning stovepipe, but it required a dedicated 2-man team, a gunner and a loader, and it took more training to use effectively. It was also more expensive to produce, so the Germans used both. Panzerschrecks went to dedicated anti-tank teams who trained with them. Panzerfausts went to everyone else. The combination meant that German infantry could threaten Allied armor at multiple ranges with varying levels of investment, and you're about to see just how effective this combination became. The first Panzerfausts reached the Eastern Front around September 1943, arriving just as Soviet tank brigades were pushing offensive after offensive. German soldiers repeatedly found themselves overrun by armored charges, and the new weapon proved immediately that it could knock out T-34s. Production expanded rapidly. Beyond simple trench defense, the Germans developed aggressive tactics. They formed Panzerjagdkommando, or tank hunter teams. Small groups of soldiers armed with Panzerfausts would set up ambushes along likely tank routes, wait until enemy tanks turned their vulnerable sides or rears toward them, then fire and escape while riflemen provided cover. It was dangerous work, but the economics made sense. One cheap, disposable tube could destroy a tank that cost enormous resources to build, crew, and transport. The numbers tell the story. In the final phase of the war, roughly 70% of Soviet armor losses came not from German tanks, not from the famous 88mm guns, but from Panzerfausts. Most of this happened in urban combat, where tanks were funneled into narrow streets and couldn't maneuver away from ambushes. Buildings provided endless hiding spots, and a soldier could fire from a window, duck back inside, and disappear before anyone knew where the shot came from. The Western Allies faced the same nightmare. In Normandy after D-Day, the bocage terrain was perfect for Panzerfaust ambushes. Dense hedgerows created a maze of small fields bordered by thick vegetation, exactly the kind of close-quarters environment where the weapon's short range didn't matter. Shermans, Churchills, tank destroyers, everything was vulnerable. Roughly a third of Allied tanks knocked out in Normandy fell to Panzerfausts and similar weapons. American and British tank crews genuinely feared them. You can see it in the improvised armor they started welding onto their vehicles. Sandbags, spare track links, logs, sheet metal, wire mesh, even bed frames. Anything that might detonate the shaped charge before it reached the main armor. This is the same concept as the cope cages we see on tanks in modern conflicts. The idea being to create standoff distance, so the warhead explodes a few inches away from the hull instead of directly against it. It didn't always work, but crews were desperate enough to try anything. Tactically, the Allies learned to never send tanks into urban areas without heavy infantry support. Soldiers would move through buildings and clear potential ambush positions before the armor rolled through. It slowed everything down, but the alternative was losing tanks to enemies they never saw. If you've seen the movie Fury, the Panzerfaust scenes probably stuck with you, and that wasn't Hollywood exaggeration. That was how it actually was. Throughout the conflict, the Panzerfaust kept evolving. Each version pushed the effective range further and increased lethality, with the naming scheme following that progression. The original Panzerfaust 30 came in two variants. The Klein, meaning small, had a 10-centimeter diameter warhead. It worked, but they quickly needed more punch, so they introduced the Panzerfaust 30 Gross, meaning big, with a larger 15-centimeter warhead. Range stayed the same, but penetration and explosive power improved significantly. In 1944, the Panzerfaust 60 became the most widely produced model. Effective range doubled to 60 meters thanks to a more than doubled propellant charge, which also helped accuracy. Millions were manufactured by 1945, and this version did most of the damage in the urban fighting of the final year. The Panzerfaust 100 pushed further still, with a heavier 6-kilogram warhead capable of penetrating up to 220 millimeters of armor. Hitting something precisely at 100 meters was ambitious, but the weapon could destroy any Allied tank, even frontally. By the time it reached units, though, the war was already in its final desperate phase. Then came the Panzerfaust 150, a serious redesign rather than just an incremental improvement. The warhead was sleeker and more pointed, with a diameter of 10.5 centimeters instead of 15. But improved explosives actually increased penetration to 300 millimeters. It used a two-stage propellant ignition system for higher velocity and better accuracy at the extended 150-meter range. There was even an optional fragmentation sleeve that could be clipped over the warhead to turn it into an anti-infantry weapon. About 100,000 were produced in 1945, but they never reached regular combat units. The factory was overrun by Soviet forces before distribution could happen. The final planned version was the Panzerfaust 250. This was something genuinely different, designed as a reloadable launcher with a pistol grip and an electrical firing system. It looked much more like modern RPGs. Production was optimistically scheduled for September 1945, but the war ended first. As the Reich collapsed, Panzerfausts were handed out to the Volkssturm, the People's Storm militia. This was anyone between 16 and 60 years old who could hold a weapon. Old men, teenagers, civilians with no military training. They were given the briefest possible instruction on how to aim and fire, and sent to face Allied armor at the doorsteps of German cities. In Berlin during the final battle, Volkssturm members armed with Panzerfausts fought in the rubble. Many died in hopeless attempts to stop the inevitable, but even untrained civilians with these weapons managed to destroy a significant number of Allied tanks in those last chaotic weeks. That's how simple the Panzerfaust was to use. When the Soviets captured the Panzerfaust 150 factory and the incomplete designs for the 250, they studied everything carefully. German engineers who had worked on these projects were interrogated. 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union introduced the RPG-2, and the resemblance to the final German concepts was not a coincidence. From there, the evolution never stopped. The crude weapons of the Second World War, the ones that could barely hit a tank at 30 meters, became the foundation for everything that followed. Today, we have weapons like the Javelin and NLAW that calculate their own trajectories, choose their own attack angles, and deliver warheads that no modern tank can reliably stop. All of it traces back to those desperate years when German soldiers needed a way to fight armor they couldn't otherwise touch.